This is your brain on risk. This is Mind Over Money, the podcast where Kevin Cook exposes the psychology of investing.
Welcome back to Mind Over Money. I'm Kevin Cook, your field guide and storyteller for the fascinating arena of behavioral economics. In the month of December, not so long ago, an American journalist accidentally met an American doctor at an army outpost in a rural town in Haiti. Mirabelais, a few hours north of Port-au-Prince on the Central Plateau, had been the scene for a grisly political assassination, and the victim was only the assistant mayor. But it was a shocking spotlight on the political struggles and lawlessness that had been rampant in Haiti for some time. The journalist, Tracy Kidder, was there to report on the 20,000 U.S. troops sent to reinstate the country's democratically elected government, and also, I quote, to strip away power from the military junta that had deposed the government and ruled with great cruelty for 3 years. Kidder was talking to an Army Special Forces captain named John Carroll, who had only 8 men to keep the peace among 150,000 Haitians, spread across about 1,000 square miles of rural Haiti. That's when the American doctor showed up at the outpost. A Harvard specialist in infectious disease and recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant early in his career, Dr. Paul Farmer worked 8 months of the year in Haiti without pay, helping the poor get some semblance of medical care in a place where many peasants had lost their land to a hydroelectric dam. Farmer, who also had a PhD in anthropology from Harvard, was still single and lived in a church rectory in a poor neighborhood of Boston while taking on the toughest infectious disease cases at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He co-founded Partners in Health in his late 20s as a way to help the people of Haiti. The journalist was now suddenly witness to a tense conversation between the 35-year-old doctor and the 29-year-old captain. The doctor heard that the captain and his men had held in custody the possible assassin who beheaded the assistant mayor of Mirabelais. One of the junta's strongmen, a rural sheriff named Nerva Juste, and it's French, so I'm not sure how good my pronunciation is there, but he was considered a frightening figure to most in the area. But the army captain let the thug go because they hadn't found any physical evidence or witnesses. I want to read about the exchange between the doctor and the captain because it seems like a microcosm of possibly hundreds of conversations that have occurred in third world countries. This is from Tracy Kidder's book, Mountains Beyond Mountains. I'll read from pages 4 and 5. Here he's talking about the army captain. I liked him. From what I'd seen, he and his men had been trying earnestly to make improvements in this piece of Haiti. But Washington, which had decreed that this mission would not include nation building, had given them virtually no tools for that job. On one occasion, the captain had ordered a U.S. Army medevac flight for a pregnant Haitian woman in distress, and his commanders had reprimanded him for his pains. Up on the balcony of the barracks now, Captain Carroll was fuming about his latest frustration when someone said there was an American out at the gate who wanted to see him. I remember thinking that Captain Carroll and Dr. Farmer made a mismatched pair, and that Farmer suffered in the comparison. The captain stood about 6'2", tanned and muscular, and a wad of snuff in his lower lip. Now and then he turned his head aside and spat. Farmer was about the same age, but much more delicate looking. He had short black hair, and a high waist and long thin arms, and his nose almost came to a point. Next to the soldier, he looked skinny and pale, and for all of that, he struck me as a bold, indeed downright cocky. He asked the captain if his team had any medical problems. The captain said they had some sick prisoners whom the local hospital had refused to treat. I ended up buying the medicine myself, said the captain. Farmer flashed a smile. You'll spend less time in purgatory. Then he asked, who cut off the head of the assistant mayor? I don't know for sure, said the captain. It's very hard to live in Haiti and not know who cut off someone's head, said Dr. Farmer. A circuitous argument followed. Farmer made it plain he didn't like the American government's plan for fixing Haiti's economy, a plan that would aid business interests but do nothing, in his view, to relieve the suffering of the average Haitian. He clearly believed that the United States had helped to foster the coup. For one thing, by having trained a high official of the junta at the U.S. Army School of the Americas. Two clear sides existed in Haiti, Farmer said, the forces of repression and the Haitian poor, which were the vast majority. Farmer was on the side of the poor, obviously. But he told the captain, it still seems fuzzy which side the American soldiers are on. Locally, part of the fuzziness came from the fact that the captain had just released the hated Nerva Juste. I sensed that Farmer knew Haiti far better than the captain, and that he was trying to impart some important information. The people in this region were losing confidence in the captain, Farmer seemed to be saying, and this was a serious matter, obviously, for a team of 9 soldiers trying to govern 150,000 people. But the warning wasn't entirely plain, and the captain got a little riled up at Farmer's denunciation of the School of the Americas. As for Nerva Juste, he said, look, that guy is a bad guy. When I do have him and the evidence, I'll slam him. He slapped a fist into his hand. But I'm not going to stoop to the level of these guys and make summary arrests. Farmer replied, in effect, that it made no sense for the captain to apply principles of constitutional law in a country that at the moment had no functioning legal system. Juste was a menace and should be locked up. So they reached a strange impasse. The captain, who described himself as a redneck, arguing for due process, and Farmer, who clearly considered himself a champion of human rights, arguing for preventive detention. Eventually, the captain said, you'd be surprised how many decisions about what I can do here get made in Washington. And Farmer relented, I understand you're constrained. Sorry if I've been haranguing you. So that was a bit of Tracy Kidder's book. You might be surprised that this exchange took place in December 1994. And Kidder caught up with Dr. Farmer in 1999 to follow him in Haiti and profile his work. That journalistic following and excellent writing eventually became the book Mountains Beyond Mountains, published in 2003. The title comes from a Haitian proverb translated as, beyond mountains, there are mountains, which Kidder must have felt described the tireless mission of Paul Farmer. Well, a lot has happened in Haiti since then. Dr. Farmer built Partners in Health so strong that they were able to fund an impressive hospital in Mirabelais by 2012, even after the devastating earthquake of 2010. But what hasn't changed is the lawlessness, the violence, and the epidemic of kidnappings for ransom. I just started reading Kidder's book this year, and I probably wondered how much political and economic life had improved, how much progress they made in 25 years. Well, we got a rude wake-up call that it hadn't improved much at all in April, when 5 Catholic priests, 2 nuns, and 3 laymen were kidnapped from a commune northeast of Port-au-Prince. And then the case of 5-year-old Oslina Genaes surfaced and sparked outrage. In their article for Reuters in April titled Descent into Hell, Kidnapping Explosion Terrorizes Haiti, Andre Poultre and Sarah Marsh wrote that Oslina was snatched off the streets of the capital, Port-au-Prince, in late January as she was playing. The child's corpse, bearing signs of strangulation, turned up a week later. According to her mother, a peanut vendor, who said she couldn't pay the $4,000 ransom. The mother's cries filled the airwaves as she spoke to a few local radio stations seeking help raising funds to cover funeral costs. And she's now in hiding after receiving death threats from the same gang that killed her daughter. I wasn't supposed to go to the radio to denounce what had happened, she told Reuters. Police in her impoverished and crime-ridden neighborhood, Martissant, told Reuters they were investigating the case, but their backlog was clear. Haiti's epidemic of kidnappings tripled in 2020 to 234 cases versus 2019, according to official data compiled by the United Nations. The Reuters authors add, the real figures are likely much higher because many Haitians don't report abductions, fearing retribution from criminal gangs. No kidding. The president of Haiti was just assassinated on July 7th by a group of mercenaries. So as if the human misery from failed, corrupt political and economic institutions wasn't enough, now this nation of 11 million faces another natural disaster, with the death toll from Saturday's 7.2 magnitude earthquake in the Western Peninsula about to breach 1,500. By the way, you can follow Sarah Marsh on Twitter to stay tuned to her coverage of the Caribbean at Reuters Sarah. Her Sarah spelled Sarah at Reuters Sarah. She's based in Cuba and just published an article yesterday on the 16th titled, "Haitians Say 2010 Quake Lessons May Have Saved Lives, but Not Enough." So I've been trying to learn more about the persistent poverty of Haiti, and I hope to get to explain some of that in our conversation today. I brought on a colleague who is well-versed. And so this man, we have so much to talk about. This may end up being a two-parter, but I was inspired by my colleague and Zach's resident economist, John Blank, who recently told us about an economic conference he participated in concerning the struggles and hopes of another poor country, Bangladesh. The People's Republic of Bangladesh is the 8th most populous country in the world. I did not know that. With a population exceeding 163 million in an area of 150,000 square kilometers. That's about 57,000 square miles, smaller than my home state, Wisconsin, making it one of the most densely populated countries in the world. John, welcome to Mind Over Money.
Kevin, glad to be here.
Listen, can you start by telling us the story of your experience at that conference about Bangladesh and what it gave you in terms of understanding the entrenched challenges of helping poor developing countries help themselves?
Yeah. First of all, I've just pulled up, typing in Google, Bangladesh per capita income. And I'm looking at the year 2000. And this is in 2019 purchasing power parity dollars. So it's adjusting out any inflation from 2000 to the present time. So at that time, Bangladesh had $1,370 in purchasing power parity income. India had $2,070 in purchasing power parity income. And Pakistan had $2,560 in purchasing parity income. So that was 20 years ago. So basically, Bangladesh was half as poor as Pakistan, and Pakistan was in the lead of India. Okay, let's go all the way to 2010. India is at $4,190 per capita. So it's basically come up extraordinarily, over doubled. Bangladesh came to 2,640 and Pakistan was at 3,820. So at that point in time, Pakistan and India 10 years ago were basically the same. Now, if we go to the present point in time, India is at $6,920 per person. Bangladesh is at $5,200 per person, and Pakistan is at $4,800. So now Bangladesh is actually richer than Pakistan was, and Pakistan was in the lead as recently as 10 years ago. So that is what is fascinating. Most people, if you would tell somebody that Bangladesh would be able to take its income in those 20 years from 1,370 to 5,200, that's they raised the average income, real income, 4 times in that period of time.
How did they do it?
Well, that's what I went to the conference for. What you'll find in Bangladesh was they actually, throw me out of the conference. I'm talking about a night of my life, but they actually had a competent government. And while a Muslim country, the leader of this country is actually a woman. And the people in the room who were the governing authorities had basically parceled out the various assignments: water, power, trade, economic zones, various other things that to to attract foreign investment. And they brought in foreign investment kind of on the lines that we have seen in places like Singapore, in places like Taiwan, in places like South Korea, and even looking further back to Japan. The basic model is no different. It's kind of turning the early colonial model where these types of places, the British would put a port in or something, the French would put a port in, the Dutch, and they would trade, to actually pretty much doing the same thing, Kevin, having special economic zones, but they were geared to modern manufacturing with power, with electric, with standards of taxation and remittances in those zones that allowed for the rest of the world to interact with the country much more easily. So, and their next stage from here is actually to do the next thing that you see also in Taiwan and South Korea is science and technology parks, because they do have a huge population, 160 million people. But they have a lot of young people who can introduce ideas through these tech parks. So I think the basic lesson of a Bangladesh is you can watch and learn from the small tigers of East Asia and implement around special economic zones the kinds of multiple dimensions to making manufacturing work. It's not just a cheap labor cost, clearly that's one part, but it's also steady power, clean water, ability to attract trained managers, skills that are in need to make certain goods. All of that gets kind of clustered inside of these special economic zones. And then over time, you just continuously add special economic zones and trade ports and various areas that kind of function separately from the country. And really how the country interacts with these zones, actually the foreigners and the money goes into these zones, but the people actually go into them during the day who are Bangladeshi. But over time, you get this, I wouldn't say raising the country is the right idea. It's raising the standards of your economic zones to compete with other economic zones. So I think the lesson that, as it was explained to me at the conference, is the right way to look at investing in a Bangladesh versus a South Korea versus a Taiwan versus a Vietnam versus a Honduras is to see on the boots on the ground and talking to investors what you get out of a special economic zone, because that's really where you're going to go, Kevin.
All right, that's fascinating. Obviously, Bangladesh could be a model for other countries. I don't know if it could be a model for Haiti. Let me just share like a quick bullet list of the problems with Haiti that would prevent any corporation from going in there and saying, okay, here's a labor source, we're going to build a factory. And it's just amazing. I mean, this was one of the first Western nations to get its independence from being colonized. In 1804, Haiti got independence from France, but the seeds were being sown for just constant civil war within the country. So you have, constant political instability. I mean, they were after the Spaniards got there and, after Columbus, and once they'd found all the gold, they left and went to Mexico to look for gold. And then the French come. And the French actually made a pretty prosperous colony by 1700. They were, sugar, coffee, and cotton. But sort of the native population had been decimated, so they had to bring in African slaves. By 1790, there were 450,000 African slaves. And then they finally revolted, and they kicked the French out. The slave uprising and revolution basically liberated the country. But in the process, they destroyed the plantations. They destroyed the sugar and cotton fields. Stuff like that happens during war. But maybe they had a chance to rebuild. But what ended up happening was land was passed down to family members. And so generation after generation, you ended up with small farmers having these little plots of land. And there were no big farms for the country to export, go back to exporting sugar and cotton, which were just, it was the most prosperous colony. It was, the island was called Hispaniola at the time, and Haiti's on the western half and Dominican Republic's on the right. But, it was just a 180-degree switch in terms of prosperity after the revolution. And I was looking at some things. Oh, what also happened is because of these small farms, you had massive soil erosion. And since there were no big farms to tax and nothing to export, any sort of ruling government would just tax the poor people. So it was kind of a kleptocracy too. Between 1843 and 1915, the country had 22 presidents, and about half of them were probably assassinated. So you can see the extent of these warring factions. The U.S. goes in there in 1915 under Woodrow Wilson, mostly to get back to make sure our debts would be paid because we'd been lending them money since 1875. So that's sort of the sense of what Wilson did, and we did some positive things. We created a transportation system and an education system, and we left behind sort of a model police force that essentially became a police state, which I guess was good for a while, but you know how those things work out. And then we get the era of the docs, right? We got Papa Doc Duvalier in 1957, essentially a ruthless dictator. And then, once he died in 1971, oh, by the way, when he died, to give you an idea of the kleptocracy, the GDP of Haiti was about 360 million, and Papa Doc had amassed a personal fortune of 150 million. So basically, he's just, stealing everything from the country and ruling with an iron fist. So then his son takes over, Baby Doc, in the 70s. He's overthrown by 1986, but he did the same thing. He had a personal fortune of 1.6 billion, while the country, put out 2.3 billion. I don't know much about the Aristide era, but I think like a couple of centuries there of the turmoil in Haiti with governance sort of gives you an idea of, just no stability to build anything. And I think that you were talking about GDP per capita. I think, Haiti is right. Haiti's in the cellar, like $756 per capita. They rank about 170 out of 190 countries. So that's sort of the backdrop. It's amazing that Dr. Paul Farmer was able to build this hospital in 2012 and have that be a core good for the poor Haitian people, but they just can't get any economic development going.
Kevin, have you a number out there for purchasing power parity dollars for Haiti?
I just found this stat as per capita GDP, the $756. So I don't know if it's in terms of PPP.
Yeah, for example, so we can compare it to Bangladesh today. Haiti's current PPP dollars is 3,040. Bangladesh, I'll throw it back out there, is 5,200. So basically, Bangladesh now is twice as rich as Haiti. And Haiti at $3,000 is less than Pakistan at $3,800 and India. So, these countries, basically Haiti's at least a decade behind these other countries.
You saw that I did a report last week on ESG investing. And I was trying to outline for people how distorted it seems when these ESG indexes and ETFs are like loaded with big cap tech. And I thought, will ESG be a force for good, eventually? And so I wrote another piece yesterday for our subscribers, going more in depth in light of the recent climate report from the IPCC. And I'm asking, does ESG investing have the potential to preserve the planet? No, we don't need to worry about saving the planet. The planet will be here, a billion years after we're gone. But we need to preserve the biosphere. And one of the things that has me concerned about these poor countries is how many of them are coastal, right? And we're about to enter in another decade. We're going to enter a new lunar cycle. The moon is in these orbital cycles of 18 and a half years, where the one we're in now, the high tides are lower. But the next phase we're going to enter in sort of the moon wobble is that the high tides will be higher. And if as sea levels rise 1 to 2 meters, over the next decade, and temperature rises, exacerbating that, we're going to see. This is where a report from NASA on July 7th. Their study projects a surge in coastal flooding starting in the 2030s. So, I mean, this is just going to make things so much harder for these poor nations that are coastal. When they're talking about seeing dozens more coastal floods per year in some of these low-lying areas. So I wanted to ask you, should we be working harder and faster to help developing countries, especially because of an accelerating climate crisis?
Well, Kevin, what you bring, environmental, social, and governance investing started as a set of criteria at the UN, basically back in Kofi Annan's day. And it was to kind of get the big money in the rich countries to focus on this issue, right? So I think you threw out a number today of 30-some trillion, 35 trillion that's now invested in this manner, which is a third of all assets that are in these institutions, right?
Yeah.
So I just throw it quickly back to you, and I mean quickly back to you. What on earth percentage does any of this go to a Bangladesh versus a Haiti?
Right. None.
I will tell you, for Haiti, the answer surely is none, right? Surely it is none in Haiti. In Bangladesh, I will tell you that there is a modest amount of investment from like an LG that's recently come in the door through a plant. And there's probably another couple major investments by different firms like LG.
Are you talking about LG, the electronics manufacturer? Okay, good.
Yeah. But what's interesting about Bangladesh in that context, and the person, the group that funded the conference I went to was a group called Walton, Walton. Have you ever heard of Walton?
Is it part of the Walton family that owns Walmart?
No, it's a name, an anglicized name. And what they were was they supplied all the fridges, the microwaves. They were basically VLG for, Bangladesh that was residents, right? Because they made the types of microwaves that people could afford there for the power systems there, the types of refrigerators that they could afford there for the types of power there. And they were very much hand in glove with the government. So this is another thing you see a lot of times is, kind of a parastatal institution that diversifies into basically everything, talking in very closely with the government. And so you line these things up and you can see absolutely no connection to a Haiti. And after a lot of inward investment from small manufacturing, nameless manufacturing firms, after a couple decades, you start to see very minimal outlines of the LGs that do, trade in these listed securities that finally come to play, right? So I basically think of Bangladesh and Haiti as in like kind of three stages. One is that totally derelict stage, which Haiti's in. Then you have the Bangladesh stage where you open these special economic zones. You have direct investment that is not listed securities at all. A lot of it comes from the diaspora of the country's immigrants that have left and have gained jobs and built businesses and put it back into the country. And a lot of it comes from people who are attracted to the deals in those special economic zones. And the third one is this area the ESG is in, which is listed public securities. So at the end of the day, how many countries have migrated from that second class of Bangladesh type outfits to that third area? And you ask yourself, wow, who's done it? South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. I would argue India is on the early stages of that, but probably very early, and it's still probably more in 2 than 3. And the rest of this is just feel-good stuff that doesn't do anything for these countries, right? So this is the problem we have, and you and I were talking about this earlier about the growth of these ESG funds and how 85% was just rebranding existing mutual funds and ETFs that were tech-focused and growth stock-focused and getting another bid up. And so I think this is sort of showing us this incredible disconnect between the types of things that succeed, direct investment in actual physical production in in-country settings that are tightly managed by the in-country government and successfully compete against other in-country direct investment settings, versus this nebulous concept of mega cap tech stocks that don't do any climate damage. You're not buying oil farms. It's just a totally different framework. So I personally, find it a little misleading to think so highly of a lot of this ESG stuff when in fact it's not clear it's having much of an effect at all.
Yeah, I mean that's the way I felt last week when I started diving into it. Is that I mean, if they're just going to take the easy ball and run with it and label big cap tech as having high ratings, maybe so I ask questions like, well, does Tesla, get high marks because it's making EVs and it's solar oriented, and are those marks high enough to ignore their impact with lithium mining? And what about Facebook? Well, Facebook has no, their carbon footprint is low, and yet you wonder about, well, what about data privacy and disinformation affecting social and governance? And then Amazon. I mean, Amazon, big warehouses everywhere, shipping, everything to you the same day, and giant data centers. Tell me those don't use electricity and have massive cooling requirements. And maybe Apple gets high marks because they're trying to be progressive on the use of labor in emerging markets. But yeah, that stuff's gonna like change the world incrementally. But yeah, it's not gonna help Bangladesh or Haiti, that's for sure.
No, and we see, Kevin, in the BRIC stocks versus the rest of the world, the emerging market stock, where the ratio of differences in prices has never been as wide as it is now, I think. So it's diverging these two stock markets, and those that are stuck in that second stage with this, truly risky direct investment models where you really do take risk putting money into physical production to export for trade or import for domestic use or to build for a new product, versus these groups that are, able to attract these big institutional dollars in Europe and Japan and the United States.
And you're saying that Bangladesh is able to attract those investment dollars?
No, it's only beginning to get very, very minimal attraction from, you from like LG. Right. Basically very minimal.
So if things are, slowly working for India as it emerges, how important a factor is India for Bangladesh? Does India have a positive influence? Do they invest or provide aid to Bangladesh because they would like to see that country, their next door neighbor on many sides, because they want to see them succeed?
I have no idea, Kevin. I would have to go and take a look at that.
Okay.
But my sense was, in the week after the conference, Bangladesh toured the entire United States. They did DC, New York, Silicon Valley, LA. The next week after, Modi announced he was pulling taxation off of foreign investment, and he was making other improvements to improve the external environment for Indian investors. So I think, this gets to the Haiti thing that's really good, is when you have a choice as a direct investor amongst these various countries, or at least these various economic zones, it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's also knowing remittances and taxes and customs requirements and all this stuff can be pushed. There's a pushback. You can start to push back on that stuff. And that already happened the other way. Bangladesh basically pushed back on India. India has long been known for kind of an onerous place for all this government oversight. And, this is the thing, is you get someone right next door to you, 160 million people, not a billion people, one government that's, really interested in bringing the money in and keeping it there. you start getting some government parity and government competition, if you will, or at least comparisons that start to look a little more favorable, and you get some pushback, right? So you take it to the Haiti model. I mean, you put a special economic zone in Haiti, you're actually close to the United States. Your shipping requirements probably be a lot less. And of course, your worry would be that you just get caught up in the mess of Haiti, the lack of power, the hurricanes, the government taking all the money.
Yeah.
And you can see that what the trap is. There's just no way anybody's going to ever bother with Haiti, right?
Right. When they have so many other choices.
When they have so many other choices.
Yeah.
That's exactly the language. When you have so many other choices. And so starting small even was what they'd have to do. They'd have to open Port-au-Prince, special economic zone. But even if you got the U.S. government or the World Bank to give money to power, to electricity, to all this stuff, unless you have a new respected government in country that's providing the oversight for remittances and taxes, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, the president who was just assassinated in July, I mean, he'd been in office for 4 years, I think, since 2017. So you're looking at, well, there must be some relative stability here, and he's trying to deal with the kidnappings for ransom epidemic, but clearly darker forces wanted him out so that they can continue running the country under cloak and dagger.
Yeah, because it pays for them. They got the black market, or the gangster element in Haiti. It's not interested in losing control of Haiti.
Yeah.
And this goes back decades, if not centuries. And so this is why special economics are so fascinating, because you don't actually improve the country. You just take a small piece of it and say, look, man, I'll go in this 10-mile area or 5-mile area or 10-block area, and I'll do business with you. And you either get it right or you get it wrong. And you focus whatever little resources you have there to get the power right, to get the water right, to get the ports and docks and all the stuff right. And you show me the accounting software and tax requirements and all this other stuff to me, or I basically don't bother at all. Right? It's a really interesting model, because it says ultimately it's the government in country that has to be put on the spot, right?
Absolutely.
And they deliver or they don't. And if you don't, then who's going to bother, right? Why bother? And so I get kind of center right or right wing about it, in the sense that you really got to leave these direct investors a spot, where the rules are stable, but you also got to, it puts them a little better negotiating position, and the government really has to clean up its act.
Yeah, I mean, there's little economic progress without investors, and if you cannot reduce country risk for an investor, then there's no money going in. Yeah, that's it. And so a lot of times you get in a place like Haiti, and that's what you see, and you've talked about today, which is accurate. You've got Papa Doc and his son. Baby Doc, 40% of the wealth of the country, 70% of the wealth of the country. Forget it, right? Forget it. I know it's a gangster country, right? And the thing, again, like most countries like this, the first investors would be Haitians who have already left, right? Who have in-country family support, who could set up small businesses in these zones and would be interested. Yeah.
But they know themselves why they're leaving is because they are remitting income to these family members or friends or whoever, and trying to circumvent all this gangster stuff, right? And then you say, okay, get the U.S. government into Haiti. Well, the U.S. government was into Haiti, right?
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson sent them in the 1915s to get loans paid off that people had made to Haiti, right? And we stayed until we get the loans paid off, right? Till the 30s. And interestingly enough, we're talking about, as we leave Afghanistan, whether it's Nicaragua or Haiti or Afghanistan, Western powers do take over these countries. We have, and we will. But it gets to that 20-year mark where it's just like done, right?
Yeah. You've done all you can.
Yeah, you can't actually, because you're not, what's different here is you can't have the U.S. government or the World Bank or whoever set up a special economic zone, because it basically, they got to deal with it's not really getting the governance fixed, right? And so there's this weird thing where some governments, have to get it right. And if you don't have a partner in country through the diaspora, through the lenders, through the other governments, through the businesses that invest, forget it.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like when I opened with the story about Dr. Paul Farmer and the Special Forces captain, 20,000 troops we sent there in 94 to, get some kind of order. And yet they were told, you're not nation building. So they really couldn't really put together a government and let the people rule themselves, and it fell apart after that too.
Yeah. Haiti, it's kind of sad that you can't find, 50 or 100 or maybe even less, 20 people, and have them run the country properly. Right.
Yeah.
It seems like such a small problem, and that's where I get a little more optimistic, because it sounds like a small problem. Like someone could do it, right?
I suppose, but as long as guns keep finding their way into the country, into the wrong hands, where you can have these small roving gangs with automatic weapons basically running the countryside and the city, who's going to stand up to them? Yeah,
and we saw what happens if you do. You get killed.
Yeah.
The other guys are tougher than you, way tougher than you.
Well, John, thanks for coming on and talking about this. There's a lot to learn. I think, obviously, things are looking up for Bangladesh. We don't have the answers for Haiti, but, maybe we revisit this in a year and see what else we've learned about economic development in the third world.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
All right, thanks, John. Talk to you soon. And for you folks, I will have an article version of this podcast on Zacks.com. It might also appear on Yahoo or NASDAQ market site. But in the article version, I'll have more links to other resources and things I've recently written about ESG and the environment. And so you can, you can just search for it. Just search ESG on Zacks.com, ZACKS.com, and you'll find more stuff, more homework that I put into this. All right, thanks for joining me, and we'll talk to you soon.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.